Chapter 9 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. An Evening at Four Winds Point. It was late September when Anne and Gilbert were able to pay Four Winds Light their promised visit. They had often planned to go, but something always occurred to prevent them. Captain Jim had dropped in several times at the little house. "I don't stand on ceremony, Mistress Blythe," he told Anne. "It's a real pleasure to me to come here, and I'm not going to deny myself just because you haven't got down to see me. There oughtn't to be no bargaining like that among the race that knows Joseph. I'll come when I can, and you come when you can, and so long's we have our pleasant little chat, it don't matter a mite what roof's over us." Captain Jim took a great fancy to Gog and Magog, who were presiding over the destinies of the hearth in the little house with as much dignity and aplomb as they had done at Patty's Place. "Aren't they the cutest little cusses?" he would say delightedly, and he bade them greeting and farewell as gravely and invariably as he did his host and hostess. Captain Jim was not going to offend household deities by any lack of reverence and ceremony. "You've made this little house just about perfect," he told Anne. "It never was so nice before. Mistress Selwyn had your taste, and she did wonders, but folks in those days didn't have the pretty little curtains and pictures and knickknacks you have. As for Elizabeth, she lived in the past. You've kind of brought the future into it, so to speak. I'd be real happy even if we couldn't talk at all when I come here. Just to sit and look at you and your pictures and your flowers would be enough of a treat. It's beautiful. Beautiful." Captain Jim was a passionate worshipper of beauty. Every lovely thing heard or seen gave him a deep, subtle inner joy that irradiated his life. He was quite keenly aware of his own lack of outward comeliness, and lamented it. "Folks say I'm good," he remarked whimsically upon one occasion, "but I sometimes wish the Lord had made me only half as good and put the rest of it into looks. But there, I reckon he knew what he was about, as a good captain should. Some of us have to be homely, or the purty ones, like Mistress Blythe here, wouldn't show up so well." One evening Anne and Gilbert finally walked down to the Four Winds Light. The day had begun somberly in gray cloud and mist, but it had ended in a pomp of scarlet and gold. Over the western hills beyond the harbor were amber deeps and crystalline shadows, with the fire of sunset below. The north was a mackerel sky of little fiery golden clouds. The red light flamed on the white sails of a vessel gliding down the channel, bound to a southern port in a land of palms. Beyond her it smote upon and incarnadined the shining, white, grassless faces of the sand dunes. To the right it fell on the old house among the willows up the brook, and gave it for a fleeting space casements more splendid than those of an old cathedral. They glowed out of its quiet and grayness like the throbbing, blood-red thoughts of a vivid soul imprisoned in a dull husk of environment. "That old house up the brook always seems so lonely," said Anne. "I never see visitors there. Of course, its lane opens on the upper road, but I don't think there's much coming and going. It seems odd we've never met the Moores yet, when they live within 15 minutes' walk of us. I may have seen them in church, of course, but if so, I didn't know them. I'm sorry they're so unsociable when there are only near neighbors." "Evidently they don't belong to the race that knows Joseph," laughed Gilbert. "Have you ever found out who that girl was whom you thought so beautiful?" "No. Somehow I have never remembered to ask about her, but I've never seen her anywhere, so I suppose she must have been a stranger. Oh, the sun has just vanished, and there's the light." As the dusk deepened, the great beacon cut swathes of light through it, sweeping in a circle over the fields and the harbor, the sandbar and the gulf. "I feel as if it might catch me and whisk me leagues out to sea," said Anne, as one drenched them with radiance, and she felt rather relieved when they got so near the point that they were inside the range of those dazzling recurrent flashes. As they turned into the little lane that led across the fields to the point, they met a man coming out of it, a man of such extraordinary appearance that for a moment they both frankly stared. He was a decidedly fine-looking person, tall, broad-shouldered, well-featured, with a Roman nose and frank gray eyes. He was dressed in a prosperous farmer's Sunday best. In so far, he might have been any inhabitant of Four Winds or the Glen. "This has been a pretty nice day all through, Mistress Blythe, and now, right at the last, it's brought its best. Would you like to sit down here outside a bit while the light lasts? I've just finished this bit of a plaything for my little grandnephew Joe up at the Glen. After I promised to make it for him I was kind of sorry, for his mother was vexed. She's afraid he'll be wanting to go to sea later on, and she doesn't want the notion encouraged in him. But what could I do, Mistress Blythe? I'd promised him, and I think it's sort of real dastardly to break a promise you make to a child. Come, sit down. It won't take long to stay an hour." The wind was offshore and only broke the sea's surface into long silvery ripples and sent sheeny shadows flying out across it from every point and headland like transparent wings. The dusk was hanging a curtain of violet gloom over the sand dunes and the headlands where gulls were huddling. The sky was faintly filmed over with scarves of silken vapor. Cloud fleets rode at anchor along the horizons. An evening star was watching over the bar. "Isn't that a view worth looking at?" said Captain Jim with a loving, proprietary pride. "Nice and far from the marketplace, ain't it? No buying and selling and getting gain. You don't have to pay anything. All that sea and sky free, without money and without price. There's going to be a moonrise pretty soon, too. I'm never tired of finding out what a moonrise can be over them rocks and sea and harbor. There's a surprise in it every time." They had their moonrise and watched its marvel and magic in a silence that asked nothing of the world or each other. Then they went up into the tower, and Captain Jim showed and explained the mechanism of the great light. Finally they found themselves in the dining room, where a fire of driftwood was weaving flames of wavering, elusive, sea-born hues in the open fireplace. "I put this fireplace in myself," remarked Captain Jim. "The government don't give lighthouse keepers such luxuries. Look at the colors that wood makes. If you'd like some driftwood for your fire, Mistress Blythe, I'll bring you up a load some day. Sit down. I'm going to make you a cup of tea." Captain Jim placed a chair for Anne, having first removed therefrom a huge orange-colored cat and a newspaper. "Get down, matey. The sofa is your place. I must put this paper away safe till I can find time to finish the story in it. It's called A Mad Love. 'Tisn't my favorite brand of fiction, but I'm reading it just to see how long she can spin it out. It's at the 62nd chapter now, and the wedding ain't any nearer than when it began, as far as I can see. When little Joe comes I have to read him pirate yarns. Ain't it strange how innocent little creatures like children like the bloodthirstiest stories?" "Like my lad Davy at home," said Anne. "He wants tales that reek with gore." Captain Jim's tea proved to be nectar. He was pleased as a child with Anne's compliments, but he affected a fine indifference. "The secret is I don't skimp the cream," he remarked airily. Captain Jim had never heard of Oliver Wendell Holmes, but he evidently agreed with that writer's dictum that big heart never liked little cream pot. "We met an odd-looking personage coming out of your lane," said Gilbert as they sipped. "Who was he?" Captain Jim grinned. "That's Marshall Elliott. A mighty fine man, with just one streak of foolishness in him. I suppose you wondered what his object was in turning himself into a sort of dime museum freak." "Is he a modern Nazarite or a Hebrew prophet left over from olden times?" asked Anne. "Neither of them. It's politics that's at the bottom of his freak. All those Elliots and Crawfords and McAllisters are dyed-in-the-wool politicians. They're born Grit or Tory, as the case may be, and they live Grit or Tory, and they die Grit or Tory, and what they're going to do in heaven, where there's probably no politics, is more than I can fathom. This Marshall Elliott was a born Grit. I'm a Grit myself in moderation, but there's no moderation about Marshall. 15 years ago there was a specially bitter general election. Marshall fought for his party tooth and nail. He was dead sure the Liberals would win. So sure he got up at a public meeting and vowed that he wouldn't shave his face or cut his hair until the Grits were in power. Well, they didn't go in, and they've never got in yet, and you saw the result today for yourselves. Marshall stuck to his word." "What does his wife think of it?" asked Anne. "He's a bachelor. But if he had a wife, I reckon she couldn't make him break that vow. That family of Elliots has always been more stubborn than natural. Marshall's brother Alexander had a dog he set great store by, and when it died the man actually wanted to have it buried in the graveyard, along with the other Christians, he said. Course he wasn't allowed to, so he buried it just outside the graveyard fence and never darkened the church door again. But Sundays he'd drive his family to church and sit by that dog's grave and read his Bible all the time the service was going on. They say when he was dying he asked his wife to bury him beside the dog. She was a meek little soul, but she fired up at that. She said she wasn't going to be buried beside no dog, and if he'd rather have his last resting place beside the dog than beside her, just to say so. Alexander Elliot was a stubborn mule, but he was fond of his wife, so he give in and said, 'Well, durn it, bury me where you please. But when Gabriel's trump blows I expect my dog to rise with the rest of us, for he had as much soul as any derned Elliot or Crawford or McAllister that ever strutted.' Them was his parting words. As for Marshall, we're all used to him, but he must strike strangers as right down peculiar looking. I've known him ever since he was 10. He's about 50 now, and I like him. Him and me was out cod fishing today. That's about all I'm good for now, catching trout and cod occasional. But 'tweren't always so, not by no manner of means. I used to do other things, as you'd admit if you saw my life book." Anne was just going to ask what his life book was when the first mate created a diversion by springing upon Captain Jim's knee. He was a gorgeous beastie, with a face as round as a full moon, vivid green eyes, and immense white double paws. Captain Jim stroked his velvet back gently. "I never fancied cats much till I found the first mate," he remarked, to the accompaniment of the mate's tremendous purrs. "I saved his life, and when you've saved a creature's life you're bound to love it. It's next thing to giving life. There's some turrible thoughtless people in the world, Mistress Blythe. Some of them city folks who have summer homes over the harbor are so thoughtless that they're cruel. It's the worst kind of cruelty, the thoughtless kind. You can't cope with it. They keep cats there in the summer and feed 'em and pet 'em and doll 'em up with ribbons and collars, and then in the fall they go off and leave 'em to starve or freeze. It makes my blood boil, Mistress Blythe. One day last winter I found a poor old mother cat dead on the shore, lying against the skin and bone bodies of her 3 little kittens. She'd died trying to shelter 'em. She had her poor stiff paws around 'em. Master, I cried. Then I swore. Then I carried them poor little kittens home and fed 'em up and found good homes for 'em. I knew the woman who left the cat, and when she come back this summer I just went over the harbor and told her my opinion of her. It was rank meddling, but I do love meddling in a good cause." "How did she take it?" asked Gilbert. "Cried and said she didn't think. I says to her, says I, 'Do you suppose that'll be held for a good excuse in the day of judgment, when you'll have to account for that poor old mother's life? The Lord'll ask you what he gave you brains for if it wasn't to think, I reckon. I don't fancy she'll leave cats to starve another time." "Was the first mate one of the forsaken?" asked Anne, making advances to him which were responded to graciously if condescendingly. "Yes. I found him one bitter cold day in winter, caught in the branches of a tree by his dern fool ribbon collar. He was almost starving. If you could have seen his eyes, Mistress Blythe. He was nothing but a kitten, and he'd got his living somehow since he'd been left, until he got hung up. When I loosed him he gave my hand a pitiful swipe with his little red tongue. He wasn't the able seaman you see now. He was meek as Moses. That was 9 years ago. His life has been long in the land for a cat. He's a good old pal, the first mate is." "I should have expected you to have a dog," said Gilbert. Captain Jim shook his head. "I had a dog once. I thought so much of him that when he died I couldn't bear the thought of getting another in his place. He was a friend, you understand, Mistress Blythe. Matey's only a pal. I'm fond of Matey, all the fonder on account of the spice of devilment that's in him, like there is in all cats. But I loved my dog. I always had a sneaking sympathy for Alexander Elliot about his dog. There isn't any devil in a good dog. That's why they're more lovable than cats, I reckon. But I'm darned if they're as interesting. Here I am, talking too much. Why don't you check me? When I do get a chance to talk to anyone, I run on terrible. If you've done your tea, I've a few little things you might like to look at. Picked 'em up in the queer corners I used to be poking my nose into." Captain Jim's few little things turned out to be a most interesting collection of curios, hideous, quaint, and beautiful. And almost every one of them had some striking story attached to it. Anne never forgot the delight with which she listened to those old tales that moonlit evening by that enchanted driftwood fire, while the silver sea called to them through the open window and sobbed against the rocks below them. Captain Jim never said a boastful word, but it was impossible to help seeing what a hero the man had been. Brave, true, resourceful, unselfish. He sat there in his little room and made those things live again for his hearers. By a lift of the eyebrow, a twist of the lip, a gesture, a word, he painted a whole scene or character so that they saw it as it was. Some of Captain Jim's adventures had such a marvelous edge that Anne and Gilbert secretly wondered if he were not drawing a rather long bow at their credulous expense. But in this, as they found later, they did him injustice. His tales were all literally true. Captain Jim had the gift of the born storyteller, whereby unhappy, far-off things can be brought vividly before the hearer in all their pristine poignancy. Anne and Gilbert laughed and shivered over his tales, and once Anne found herself crying. Captain Jim surveyed her tears with pleasure shining from his face. "I like to see folks cry that way," he remarked. "It's a compliment. But I can't do justice to the things I've seen or helped to do. I've 'em all jotted down in my life book, but I haven't got the knack of writing them out properly. If I could hit on just the right words and string 'em together proper on paper, I could make a great book. It would beat a mad love holler, and I believe Joe'd like it as well as the pirate yarns. Yes, I've had some adventures in my time, and you know, Mistress Blythe, I still lust after 'em. Yes, old and useless as I be, there's an awful longing sweeps over me at times to sail out there forever and ever." "Like Ulysses, you would sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until you die," said Anne dreamily. "Ulysses? I've read of him. Yes, that's just how I feel. Just how all us old sailors feel, I reckon. I'll die on land after all, I suppose. Well, what is to be will be. There was an old William Ford at the Glen who never went on the water in his life 'cause he was afraid of being drowned. A fortune teller had predicted he would be, and one day he fainted and fell with his face in the barn trough and was drowned. Must you go? Well, come soon and come often. The doctor is to do the talking next time. He knows a heap of things I want to find out. I'm sort of lonesome here by times. It's been worse since Elizabeth Russell died. Her and me was such cronies." Captain Jim spoke with the pathos of the aged, who see their old friends slipping from them one by one, friends whose places can never be quite filled by those of a younger generation, even of the race that knows Joseph. Anne and Gilbert promised to come soon and often. "He's a rare old fellow, isn't he?" said Gilbert as they walked home. "Somehow I can't reconcile his simple, kindly personality with the wild, adventurous life he has lived," mused Anne. "You wouldn't find it so hard if you had seen him the other day down at the fishing village. One of the men of Peter Gautier's boat made a nasty remark about some girl along the shore. Captain Jim fairly scorched the wretched fellow with the lightning of his eyes. He seemed a man transformed. He didn't say much, but the way he said it, you'd have thought it would strip the flesh from the fellow's bones. I understand that Captain Jim will never allow a word against any woman to be said in his presence." "I wonder why he never married," said Anne. "He should have sons with their ships at sea now, and grandchildren climbing over him to hear his stories. He's that kind of a man. Instead, he has nothing but a magnificent cat." But Anne was mistaken. Captain Jim had more than that. He had a memory. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Anne's House of Dreams by Lucy Maud Montgomery. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 10. Leslie Moore. "I'm going for a walk to the outside shore tonight," Anne told Gog and Magog one October evening. There was no one else to tell, for Gilbert had gone over the harbor. Anne had her little domain in the speckless order one would expect of anyone brought up by Marilla Cuthbert, and felt that she could gad shoreward with a clear conscience. Many and delightful had been her shore rambles, sometimes with Gilbert, sometimes with Captain Jim, sometimes alone with her own thoughts and new, poignantly sweet dreams that were beginning to span life with their rainbows. She loved the gentle, misty harbor shore and the silvery, wind-haunted sand shore, but best of all she loved the rock shore with its cliffs and caves and piles of surf-worn boulders and its coves where the pebbles glittered under the pools. And it was to this shore she hied herself tonight. There had been an autumn storm of wind and rain lasting for 3 days. Thunderous had been the crash of billows on the rocks, wild the white spray and spume that blew over the bar, troubled and misty and tempest-torn the erstwhile blue peace of Four Winds Harbor. Now it was over, and the shore lay clean washed after the storm. Not a wind stirred, but there was still a fine surf on, dashing on sand and rock in a splendid white turmoil, the only restless thing in the great, pervading stillness and peace. "Oh, this is a moment worth living through weeks of storm and stress for," Anne exclaimed, delightedly sending her far gaze across the tossing waters from the top of the cliff where she stood. Presently she scrambled down the steep path to the little cove below, where she seemed shut in with rocks and sea and sky. "I'm going to dance and sing," she said. "There's no one here to see me. The seagulls won't carry tales of the matter. I may be as crazy as I like." She caught up her skirt and pirouetted along the hard strip of sand just out of reach of the waves that almost lapped her feet with their spent foam. Whirling round and round, laughing like a child, she reached the little headland that ran out to the east of the cove. Then she stopped suddenly, blushing crimson. She was not alone. There had been a witness to her dance and laughter. The girl of the golden hair and sea blue eyes was sitting on a boulder of the headland, half hidden by a jutting rock. She was looking straight at Anne with a strange expression, part wonder, part sympathy, could it be envy? She was bareheaded, and her splendid hair, more than ever like Browning's gorgeous snake, was bound about her head with a crimson ribbon. She wore a dress of some dark material, very plainly made, but swathed about her waist, outlining its fine curves, was a vivid girdle of red silk. Her hands, clasped over her knee, were brown and somewhat work-hardened, but the skin of her throat and cheeks was as white as cream. A flying gleam of sunset broke through a low-lying western cloud and fell across her hair. For a moment she seemed the spirit of the sea personified, all its mystery, all its passion, all its elusive charm. You must think me crazy," stammered Anne, trying to recover her self-possession. To be seen by this stately girl in such an abandon of childishness, she, Mrs. Dr. Blythe, with all the dignity of the matron to keep up, it was too bad. "No," said the girl, "I don't." She said nothing more. Her voice was expressionless, her manner slightly repellent, but there was something in her eyes, eager yet shy, defiant yet pleading, which turned Anne from her purpose of walking away. Instead, she sat down on the boulder beside the girl. "Let's introduce ourselves," she said, with the smile that had never yet failed to win confidence and friendliness. "I'm Mrs. Blythe, and I live in that little white house up the harbor shore." "Yes, I know," said the girl. "I am Leslie Moore, Mrs. Dick Moore," she added stiffly. Anne was silent for a moment from sheer amazement. It had not occurred to her that this girl was married. There seemed nothing of the wife about her. And that she should be the neighbor whom Anne had pictured as a commonplace Four Winds housewife. Anne could not quickly adjust her mental focus to this astonishing change. Then you live in that gray house up the brook," she stammered. "Yes. I should have gone over to call on you long ago," said the other. She did not offer any explanation or excuse for not having gone. "I wish you would come," said Anne, recovering herself somewhat. "We're such near neighbors we ought to be friends. That is the sole fault of Four Winds. There aren't quite enough neighbors. Otherwise it is perfection." "You like it?" "Like it? I love it. It is the most beautiful place I ever saw." "I've never seen many places," said Leslie Moore slowly, "but I've always thought it was very lovely here. I love it too." She spoke as she looked, shyly yet eagerly. Anne had an odd impression that this strange girl, the word girl would persist, could say a good deal if she chose. "I often come to the shore," she added. "So do I," said Anne. "It's a wonder we haven't met here before." "Probably you come earlier in the evening than I do. It is generally late, almost dark when I come. And I love to come just after a storm, like this. I don't like the sea so well when it's calm and quiet. I like the struggle and the crash and the noise." "I love it in all its moods," declared Anne. "The sea at Four Winds is to me what Lover's Lane was at home. Tonight it seemed so free, so untamed. Something broke loose in me, too, out of sympathy. That was why I danced along the shore in that wild way. I didn't suppose anybody was looking, of course. If Miss Cornelia Bryant had seen me she would have foreboded a gloomy prospect for poor young Dr. Blythe." "You know Miss Cornelia?" said Leslie, laughing. She had an exquisite laugh. It bubbled up suddenly and unexpectedly with something of the delicious quality of a baby's. Anne laughed too. "Oh, yes. She's been down to my house of dreams several times." "Your house of dreams?" "Oh, that's a dear, foolish little name Gilbert and I have for our home. We just call it that between ourselves. It slipped out before I thought." "So Miss Russell's little white house is your house of dreams," said Leslie wonderingly. "I had a house of dreams once, but it was a palace," she added with a laugh, the sweetness of which was marred by a little note of derision. "Oh, I once dreamed of a palace, too," said Anne. "I suppose all girls do. And then we settle down contentedly in 8-room houses that seem to fulfill all the desires of our hearts, because our prince is there. You should have had your palace, really, though. You're so beautiful. You must let me say it. It has to be said. I'm nearly bursting with admiration. You are the loveliest thing I ever saw, Mrs. Moore." "If we're to be friends, you must call me Leslie," said the other with an odd passion. "Of course I will. And my friends call me Anne." "I suppose I am beautiful," Leslie went on, looking stormily out to sea. "I hate my beauty. I wish I had always been as brown and plain as the brownest and plainest girl at the fishing village over there. Well, what do you think of Miss Cornelia?" The abrupt change of subject shut the door on any further confidences. "Miss Cornelia is a darling, isn't she?" said Anne. "Gilbert and I were invited to her house to a state tea last week. You've heard of groaning tables." "I seem to recall seeing the expression in the newspaper reports of weddings," said Leslie, smiling. "Well, Miss Cornelia's groaned. At least it creaked, positively. You couldn't have believed she would have cooked so much for 2 ordinary people. She had every kind of pie you could name, I think, except lemon pie. She said she had taken the prize for lemon pies at the Charlottetown exhibition 10 years ago and had never made any since for fear of losing her reputation for them." "Were you able to eat enough pie to please her?" "I wasn't. Gilbert won her heart by eating I won't tell you how much. She said she never knew a man who didn't like pie better than his Bible. Do you know, I love Miss Cornelia." "So do I," said Leslie. "She is the best friend I have in the world." Anne wondered secretly why, if this were so, Miss Cornelia had never mentioned Mrs. Dick Moore to her. Miss Cornelia had certainly talked freely about every other individual, in or near Four Winds. "Isn't that beautiful?" said Leslie, after a brief silence, pointing to the exquisite effect of a shaft of light falling through a cleft in the rock behind them, across a dark green pool at its base. "If I had come here and seen nothing but just that, I would go home satisfied." "The effects of light and shadow all along these shores are wonderful," agreed Anne. "My little sewing room looks out on the harbor, and I sit at its window and feast my eyes. The colors and shadows are never the same 2 minutes together." "And you're never lonely?" asked Leslie abruptly. "Never, when you were alone?" "No. I don't think I've ever been really lonely in my life," answered Anne. "Even when I'm alone I have real good company, dreams and imaginations and pretendings. I like to be alone now and then, just to think over things and taste them. But I love friendship and nice, jolly little times with people. Oh, won't you come see me often? Please do. I believe," Anne added, laughing, "that you'd like me if you knew me." "I wonder if you would like me," said Leslie seriously. She was not fishing for a compliment. She looked out across the waves that were beginning to be garlanded with blossoms of moonlit foam, and her eyes filled with shadows. "I'm sure I would," said Anne. "And please don't think I'm utterly irresponsible because you saw me dancing on the shore at sunset. No doubt I shall be dignified after a time. You see, I haven't been married very long. I feel like a girl, and sometimes like a child yet." "I have been married 12 years," said Leslie. Here was another unbelievable thing. "Why, you can't be as old as I am," exclaimed Anne. "You must have been a child when you were married." "I was 16, said Leslie, rising and picking up the cap and jacket lying beside her. "I am 28 now. Well, I must go back." "So must I. Gilbert will probably be home. But I'm so glad we both came to the shore tonight and met each other." Leslie said nothing, and Anne was a little chilled. She had offered friendship frankly, but it had not been accepted very graciously, if it had not been absolutely repelled. In silence they climbed the cliffs and walked across a pasture field of which the feathery, bleached wild grasses were like a carpet of creamy velvet in the moonlight. When they reached the shore lane, Leslie turned. "I go this way, Mrs. Blythe. You will come over and see me sometime, won't you?" Anne felt as if the invitation had been thrown at her. She got the impression that Leslie Moore gave it reluctantly. "I will come if you really want me to," she said a little coldly. "Oh, I do," exclaimed Leslie, with an eagerness which seemed to burst forth and beat down some restraint that had been imposed on it. "Then I'll come. Good night, Leslie." "Good night, Mrs. Blythe." Anne walked home in a brown study and poured out her tale to Gilbert. "So Mrs. Dick Moore isn't one of the race that knows Joseph?" said Gilbert teasingly. "No, not exactly. And yet I think she was one of them once, but has gone or got into exile," said Anne musingly. "She is certainly very different from the other women about here. You can't talk about eggs and butter to her. To think I've been imagining her a second Mrs. Rachel Lynde. Have you ever seen Dick Moore, Gilbert?" "No. I've seen several men working about the fields of the farm, but I don't know which was more." "She never mentioned him. I know she isn't happy." "From what you tell me, I suppose she was married before she was old enough to know her own mind or heart, and found out too late that she had made a mistake. It's a common tragedy enough, Anne. A fine woman would have made the best of it. Mrs. Moore has evidently let it make her bitter and resentful." "Don't let us judge her till we know," pleaded Anne. "I don't believe her case is so ordinary. You will understand her fascination when you meet her, Gilbert. It is a thing quite apart from her beauty. I feel that she possesses a rich nature into which a friend might enter as into a kingdom, but for some reason she bars everyone out and shuts all her possibilities up in herself so that they cannot develop and blossom. There, I've been struggling to define her to myself ever since I left her, and that is the nearest I can get to it. I'm going to ask Miss Cornelia about her." End of chapter 10.